Hello and welcome. Today is part of my interview series with a number of established professors looking at their academic and professional background for the purpose of a graduate student class that I'm taking called Preparing the Future Professoriate. In today's interviews, I'm going to be talking with some established professors to kind of learn about their particular and personal journeys through academia and how they've seen the roles, responsibilities, and duties of professorship change across their careers. For the first interview, I bring in my advisor, Dr. Shuhai Xiao, a world expert on Precambrian biology, paleontology, and geology. And so Shuhai, would you like to introduce yourself and give a little bit of a background?
Yeah, thanks, Morrison. So my name is Shuhai Xiao. As Morrison mentioned, I'm a paleontologist. I study Precambrian fossils to understand the ancient life and the Earth environment back in the Precambrian time, which ranged from 3.5 billion years ago to a little bit more than 500 million years ago. So that's a big chunk of the geological time. I became a paleontologist almost accidentally. Most people would say, most people would say, oh, I became a scientist or paleontologist because of, I was interested in fossils when I was a little kid. This is not my story. I grew up in a rural area in South China, and when I was young, I mostly worked in a farm, had very little interaction with science or scientists. So I went to school, of course, and I just wanted to get to college when I was in high school. So I had no idea what geology was or what paleontology was. But when it was time for me to decide where to apply for college, and it was very difficult. It was the 1960s, and the percentage of high school students that went to college is about 4%. So a very low percentage. Most people don't get the chance to go to college. So my first priority was to go to college, and I was interested in biology in general. But at that time, when you look at the application form, most of the biology department and the chemistry department didn't take students who had color blindness or sinus problem, because they had to smell the chemicals to see the different colors. But then I saw something listed as paleobiology. It didn't say anything about color blindness or sinus problem. So I checked paleobiology. That's how I got into paleobiology. And
Oh, this is just kind of an aside, but if I remember correctly, listening to you kind of recount some of your history earlier, I seem to recall that kind of in your primary and early secondary education, kind of each time you went to a different school, I remember you saying that you had to learn a new dialect to communicate effectively.
Exactly. So my elementary school education was very informal. I didn't actually register as a student when I was in the first grade. It was just because my cousin, who is 2 years older than me, and I usually follow him to play. So he went to school, and I also went to school with him. And then, not as a student, I just sit in there hoping to play with him. I had no textbook, and so when it is time for him to go to second grade, I just follow him to second grade, and he just said, why did you? And then by second grade, I was at the age of the schooling age. So I was eligible for schools. But anyway, so that I sort of developed my interest as it goes. And I didn't, I wasn't determined to be a paleontologist. And once I got into college, and I found it interesting. It was a big jump of intellectually for me, because the magnitude of time and the space that paleontologists and the geologists think is very different from our sort of daily life conception of time and the space. So that was a big jump for me. But I really enjoyed the fieldwork part of the student life. So every summer we went to different places to look at rocks. I got to travel to different city, different places in the country. So it was, I slowly, developed interest in it and I liked it. And I think I was very lucky. Not everyone in my class really liked the paleontology, and a few of them actually quit. So to me, it turned out to be fine. I think um, didn't regret at all to have chosen study paleontology, and it really fits my interest. So that's a little bit about after I graduate from university, from college. I worked for a oil company for a couple of years, and I did a lot of field work in the Tarim Basin in northwest China, petroleum exploration mostly. And then I found it a little boring, the kind of work in the petroleum industry. It's mostly because I was taught to do certain kind of task and every day. So there's a lot of repetitiveness in my work, and I found it boring, and there wasn't a lot of intellectual challenge. So I decided to go to graduate school.
Just as kind of a side question about your experience in the oil industry, I'm thinking a little bit about the time period there. And if I'm remembering correctly, that was kind of around the time where a lot of oil companies were developing a lot of the science of sequence stratigraphy.
Yeah, it was late 1980s and the early 1990s. And the Tarim Basin it's one of the big basin and emerging oil field in China. And my task is mostly working on the Mesozoic, so it's younger rocks. But a lot of people working on the Paleozoic in the basin, where sequence stratigraphy is more useful. But in the Paleozoic, it's mostly small lakes and percussion and fluvial deposits. Yeah. So yeah, after I went to graduate school, I sort of became interested in Precambrian paleobiology. I found it it's a new territory. Very little is known about Precambrian paleobiology. Certainly not as much as in the Paleozoic. So there's a lot of there are a lot of opportunity for new discoveries. So I spent the last 20 or so years working on the Precambrian.
That's one thing that I kind of appreciate about early Paleozoic and Precambrian research, that in kind of my conception, it requires a little bit more imagination and openness to strange ideas, in the sense that, when you're doing like Cenozoic paleobiology and you find an early mammal, it looks kind of like an opossum and you have an idea of what it is. Whereas like in the early Paleozoic and in the Precambrian, you find something that's clearly something, and it's clearly something very interesting, but it's a lot harder to contextualize what it is exactly. And that requires that you have to entertain a lot of very contradictory ideas to really get at what things are.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's one of the things that got me interested, in the Precambrian and the Paleozoic, also early Paleozoic, where we have done some work. So you mentioned how does it progress through my career in terms of responsibilities. So obviously, when I was a graduate student, I focused almost exclusively on research. Of course, I had to take the required courses. I was a TA, a teaching assistant for most of the time. So I taught, biology laboratories for the pre-med students. I taught geology labs for the undergrads. So, but most of my time is, on research, including field work and processing the samples in the lab and analyzing the samples in the lab. And I was very lucky in a lab that is filled with different kinds of scientists that some of them are working on geochemistry, some on sedimentology, and some on paleobotany, and invertebrate paleontology. So I had a chance to interact with all of them, and I picked up some sedimentology from my fellow sedimentology graduate student, and some geochemistry from my colleagues and friends who study at stable isotope geochemistry. So that turns out to be very valuable, and I had been collaborating with some of them in the last 20 years. So I think that sort of cross pollination is very, very useful. But after my PhD, I did a short postdoc for 2 years in the same lab. So, that's also almost exclusively on research, although I began to write proposals, sort of longer proposals, postdoc proposals, and other research proposals. And after that, and in my postdoc time, I developed a couple of new field sites. So in geology, it's very important to develop a site of your own. So you sort of, particularly, break a new ground in one area. So
Sometimes quite literally.
yeah, I went to Northwest China, where I had some experience when I worked for the oil company, so the Tarim Basin. And I knew there were some Precambrian rocks there, but very little was known about them. So I think that time in the 1990s, late 1990s, there were really two groups of people who had looked at these Precambrian rocks. The first study was in 1910 to 1920s by a group of Swedish geologists who selected the area in the region. And then in the 1970s and 1980s, a group of Chinese geologists worked a little bit more on the mapping and also the stratigraphy. So I thought, there might be some interesting opportunity there. So I went there and collected a bunch of samples and did some field work, and that became one of the sites that I've been working on for the next 5 or 10 years. And after that, after my postdoc, I started a faculty position at Tulane University in Louisiana. It was a very good university, and the department is a bit small, but the students are really they're very motivated. It's not as big as Virginia Tech, where I'm now, and particularly the geology department was not very big. But it's a pretty nice school, and most of the students are highly motivated. But in terms of geology, I sort of found there are a number of things. One is there's some family factors that I had a little kid who needed to go to kindergarten, so we started to move, and I ended up in Blacksburg at Virginia Tech. So I've been here since 2003. So this is my 17th year. And as it changed, responsibilities certainly evolved over the years. When I was a junior faculty, I focused on, writing proposals, getting my research done, getting my papers published, teaching and advising students. So early years, I was under the pressure of getting, tenured, and so productivity is a major issue for most junior faculty. Getting research funding, because you can't do research without funding. Publishing papers, there was some pressure on research. After I get tenured, of course, I think continue to do research. Of course, I'd probably publish it a little bit more, but it's mostly through collaboration, because after you get more established, there are more opportunities for collaboration, and I think more focus had been shifted to advising students. I probably had a couple more students on average than I was a junior faculty, and postdocs or visiting students. So helping the students to get their career established, help them get things published, finding jobs or postdocs. So and I think there's also more sort of research, services, including both the university service and the professional service. So I've been sitting on a number of committees and many editorial boards, reviewing a lot of papers, proposals. So that becomes, I would say, that becomes a sometimes is big time sink, but it's rewarding. You get to know, what's behind the paper that you're reading, the published paper. I was one of the associate editors in Precambrian research, so a lot of papers in my field are published in this journal. So I know, the background, the previous versions of the paper and how they have changed through the revisions. So it's interesting to know some of the insights, and also it's an opportunity to learn how science is done from A to Z, the field to the papers. Yeah.
I bet that kind of editorship is very valuable for kind of mid-career faculty professors. And I would guess that because, it puts you in so much direct contact that you're having to read and review, so many things being put out kind of in the field that you're doing. It kind of forces you to stay aware of ongoing developments in it. And like you said, it's allowing you to see a paper's evolution as well as it's responding to criticism and taking shape. That's probably both good for your own development as a research writer, but also keeping you kind of abreast of developments in the field.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's very useful for my own career development as well. And I think it's good for the community also, make sure that the best research get published. And particularly in this time, the information, there's just lots of information, and not all information is equal. You need to have some sort of quality control at the journals, and the reviewers, the editors play some of the roles in sort of quality control. And so I think this is a valuable thing in for the community also.
So one other thing I wanted to ask about is, between your personal experience, both with Chinese and the American system, but also you have experience with both graduate school and the academic systems of several other countries through students that you've advised. Like I know in recent years, you've advised students, not only recent students from China, but also students currently in Brazil, students from Russia. How do the structure of graduate programs and of like professorship appointments differ between these areas that you've worked with and in?
Yes, a lot. So in the U.S., we have the tenure system, professor appointments. You go through the assistant, associate, and the full professor, and you apply for tenure up to 6 years in 5, 6 years, and as assistant professor. In other countries, not I know better the Chinese system than the Russian and Brazil system. In China, they're slowly developing something similar to the tenure track system, but not exactly the same. I had two former students who are now faculty at Peking University or Beijing University. That's a top university in China, and they're both in the same department. And one of them is sort of on the tenure track system. The other is on the sort of traditional system. So I think now it's a transition from the traditional system to the tenure track system. So they take both type of professors. You can choose to be a traditional system or the tenure track system. The tenure track system is pretty much the same as the American system here. You have a 5 or 6 years of probation period, and then you go through a international review. Department will ask 5, 6 letters from colleagues in your field, and it's not limited to those in China. And then I've written some of the letters for promotion and tenure case in China. The old system or the traditional system is very different. It's basically a permanent position once you've got the job. So, and there's an annual evaluation, but you would not told to go if you fail the evaluation. But this is not true for the new system. In Brazil, I think they have something similar to tenure track, but not exactly the same. But I have to say I don't know a lot of detail. I think the difference is perhaps the rate of failing is pretty low. So very rarely people let go. In Russia, so I didn't have any interaction with researchers in college. I worked with a friend who is a researcher in the Russian Academy of Sciences. And I think, again, the system is sort of more or less a permanent position. Yeah, so there are some varieties, some variations.
And so one other thing that I wanted to ask you about was, what kind of changes do you foresee coming in kind of the structure and organization and responsibilities of faculty positions here in the US?
Well, changes, it always comes very slowly, particularly in a democratic country like the US. It takes time to make change. But I've seen some discussion in the media or internet or just among colleagues that the tenure system need to be changed. I think the tenure system it gives faculty freedom to do their research because they have the job security. They can do the kind of research they're interested in, and to sort of maximize their talent, to contribute to the society. But everything has two sides, I think, including the tenure system. Someone can game the tenure system. So I honestly don't know, where to go. My suspicion is that the tenure systems probably considering the pros and the cons, the benefits and the disadvantage. It's probably going to stay for quite a while. But the other thing that has been changing that I've seen is that instead of completely getting rid of the tenure system, many universities are hiring more and more sort of non-tenure track professors.
The rise of adjunct professors.
Not necessarily adjunct. So they have different names, but it's a kind of teaching faculty, research faculty, professor in practice, collegiate professors. So I think that's there are more opportunities in this area, sort of, this kind of position, they're not guaranteed tenure, but it's pretty much almost like tenure, but some of the faculties focused on teaching, other focused on research, but the university does not guarantee tenure, so they could be let go. I've seen that more and more, and then in some departments, I would say a quarter of the faculty is now this non-tenure track faculty, research scientists, and I suspect this is going to be more and more. So for our students, when they look for a job, I think they have to be open. Some of this job is a lot more almost like a freelance job. It's like you're a writer, and you can teach at multiple departments and multiple universities. Involves some challenge as well, but this looks like it's one of the trends.
This is kind of a lighthearted question, but it's kind of drawing on your experience and an experience that I've heard from a number of other paleontologists. But do you think that there'll continue to be a long history of paleontology graduate students teaching anatomy labs for biology and pre-med students?
Yeah, there's always a need, right? So, particularly vertebrate paleontology, they are pretty good at the bones and the muscles, right? As good, if not better than any, med school faculty. So I think this is one of the job opportunities for our students, particularly vertebrate students. And when I was at graduate school, two of the vertebrate paleontologists, they're both teaching. They were both teaching at a medical school, anatomy. So, yeah, and this is true in several other universities as well.